This is John Gilroy from the Federal Tech Podcast.
And this is Patrick Sullivan from Akamai Technologies.
Today, we're going to answer the question, is the API the new network? Hit the music, Manny.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, where industry leaders share insights on innovation with a focus on reducing cost and improving security for federal technology. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcast.
Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator. In the virtual studio today, we have world-famous Patrick Sullivan, CTO Security Strategy at Akamai Technologies. And you heard the tease opening here. Patrick is going to explain to our federal listeners what the heck people mean when they say the API is the network. So Patrick, I read this in an article 2 months ago and thought of you, had to drag you in here. So what is this phrase, the API is the network? What's going on here?
Yeah, so John, I think APIs continue to be in the news for a variety of reasons, but I guess maybe the central point you're trying to hit there is, as our application development patterns shift, years ago we had sort of these big monolithic applications that everybody would build to. They were kind of slower, clunky. All of the hip developers, in the last 10 years, really prefer to break that down into sort of a more of a microservices architecture, maybe the term that you hear, but both internal to the application, kind of laterally to partners, and then certainly facing consumers, we see APIs kind of taking over as the predominant development pattern.
I remember working with software developers, and we'd always sit on a whiteboard and draw things out and everything else. And in preparing for this interview, I listened to your interview on Feds at the Edge. And the Edge, so if I had a whiteboard here, I'd draw a network, and I'd have edge devices, and I think I'm really on top of things. Then I'd have virtual servers and hybrid. But I would never think of putting containers and API as part of this network. But it really is, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, so one of those pieces is sort of the architecture and the where, and I guess the other piece is the how. So the where, we think of the edge from Akamai's perspective is sort of having layer 7 optimization and security inspection very close to end users, wherever they may be, wherever close to compute, wherever that may be, and really we think that's sort of the optimal location to perform security inspection. And then in terms of other development patterns, wherever that compute may exist, it continues to be evolved. So certainly you see containers as part of that workload, and these days you see containers running potentially at what looks like an edge location. So it's there's continual push to get closer and closer to end users, both with security as well as the compute itself.
One of my local heroes here is a guy named Dave Linthicum. He's only written 23 books. He's not that smart. And so I typed in, Akamai and your name and doing some research this morning, and I stumbled on an article that David wrote in 2010. And the title of the article fits right in with the discussion today. It's API is everything for cloud computing. I mean, that's prescience, isn't it? That's looking into the future.
I think so, yeah. And John, I guess, from the vantage point that I've had being at Akamai now for 17 and a half, coming up on 18 years, really for us, it was when we saw the iPhone, come out. We used to see, 90-something% of traffic traversing our platform be traditional web-based traffic. But that really has swung in the other direction. These days, it's 80-something% of hits that we see on a daily basis or API hits. And that's billions and billions of hits a day, as you said. Predominantly, they're on the business to consumer side. It's an API world, whether that's somebody on their mobile phone, with a native app that's accessing a B2C API, or whether it's a partner application that's leveraging an API in that capacity. It's that certainly from 2010 you could see the pattern, but it's certainly taken over these days.
If I were on the computer version of Jeopardy and they had me define the term scraping, well, I know what happens. I go to the Patrick Sullivan website and I scrape his stuff and I steal it fair and square. Well, there's a whole new variation on scraping, isn't there?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one of the trends that we've seen over the last year is that scraping of APIs is sort of the new data breach, right? There have been a number of very high profile breaches, in 2022, where somebody would get a hold of an API that the authorization was not engineered appropriately, and you can scrape an entire customer database. And we saw, huge national level ISPs and telcos get hit, and you can make your way then to really enumerate quite a bit of information about the citizens of that country, right? We've seen similar trends hit financial services and elsewhere. So if you get an API that ends up being exposed, that the security team maybe wasn't aware about, or maybe the developers had not, what tends to get people is authorization. The number one risk with APIs is broken object level authorization, where there's an API out there and somebody can just continue to make requests without authorizing each individual request, and you scrape that and you can get yourself into trouble. We continue to see that pattern play out.
If you took my last 50 podcast interviews and did a word cloud on it, I'm sure one pop-up, it has to be zero trust. We know that. But there's number two probably is visibility. And when I think about network visibility, and many of my guests think about network visibility, I mean, they're the same thing as I'm thinking on the whiteboard. I'm thinking two-dimensional. This links to this. Sometimes, maybe it goes to railroads. Sometimes it goes to data centers. Sometimes hybrid pub. But we'd never think of actually the API as having a presence there and having to be authenticated. It's a whole change in perspective, isn't it?
It is. And I think that's probably the first challenge people try to address with APIs. It's so easy for developers to spin them up. And often you find developers who are kind of assuming that they had the same level of protection that they did when they had those monolithic applications, but yet they're exposing business logic in a very direct way. So the first hurdle people try to tackle with APIs is discovery of, what we would call shadow APIs or zombie APIs. There are a variety of kind of colorful terms here, but really the common denominator is that some developer somewhere, either at early in the life cycle or maybe at the end of the life cycle, has an API that's been exposed outside of governance or the knowledge of the security team. So the first challenge is just inventory of assets. Typically, as a security team, do I at least from a starting point know where my APIs are? That's kind of one of the fundamental concepts that we see in security time and again. As you say, you can't protect what you don't know about, right? So first, let's get eyes on it, understand where our APIs are, and then you can start to work your way up the maturity cycle of reducing risk. But it's very important to get your hands on the APIs that are being published.
Regular listeners of this podcast know that I love to go to Google Trends and type in trending phrases and see what's going on. So I got up this morning and I typed in software-defined network on Google Trends since 2004. It's been around a long time. I mean, I think it peaked in 2004, 2005, but this whole software-defined network, are we at the point now? Are we at the transition point where finally there's enough hybrid and public cloud available and maybe control devices that we can actually take advantage of software-defined networks like we couldn't 20 years ago?
I think so. Yeah, I think if you look at the way that we manage things like infrastructure DDoS, that's been on the rise. Whenever you have geopolitical tension, there seems to be DDoS that comes along with it. So we've seen a lot of organizations that are at least sympathetic to state sponsors and lashing out at the West, healthcare and government and finance. So I think the way that we try to engineer solutions there these days is far more software defined than kind of the conventional approach that we took years and years ago. So, John, I think as always, your searches on Google Trends are spot on. seems to align.
I do a lot of searching, and so I searched API and just for fun because there's Black Hat and there's all kinds of conferences popping up around here, and I found an API security conference. So, Patrick, I don't think you're hidden in the corner here like a lone man in the woods screaming out. No. I mean, this apparently is becoming something popular in the security community where it's not just a few esoteric people understand it, but this is becoming more and more discussed in the areas of security in general, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, I think as we talk to security leaders on their threats across a variety of industries, you mentioned zero trust. That's near the top of the list. I would say API security is on that top 3 to 5 as well. And as you said, there are entire security conferences dedicated to that. I had the opportunity to speak at one last year. Hopefully I'll be out there again this year. But even beyond that, at the mainstream black hat RSA. It is a very large topic of conversation. And I think, as you mentioned, we've seen sort of in the application security world, the gold standard there is kind of the OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Protection, and they have carved out over the last 5-6 years a individual set of risks specific to APIs, how that differs from traditional web applications. And it's worth a read, but I think the one sentence summary is, with the APIs, it's far more about authorization and authentication. 80% of the top 5 are auth-in or auth-z. And it really comes down to you're exposing this business logic more directly. And there's more opportunity for a developer to run into challenges there than you would with a big monolithic application that gets lots of focus. There's just more opportunity for risk there.
Yeah, I use a couple monolithic applications to run my little business here, but I never think of containers. I don't. It's the last thing I ever think of. But from a software development perspective, well, guess what? They're everywhere, and they have to be at least visible to a security consultant like you.
Yeah, I think the security team needs to know about it. I think that's actually a positive sign, John, that you can develop an application without thinking about the infrastructure, right? I mean, means that things are working as they should, right? We should abstract that away, and you bring the code to the table, and you leverage, in the shared responsibility model, somebody to do a lot of that for you, right? You shouldn't have to be an expert on web hosting to be able to develop software.
Well, the phrase that pays is zero trust. And I'm looking at your experience. Was it 18 years? You've seen a lot of topics come and go, and I think zero trust maybe stick around for a while. So how does zero trust fit in this discussion of API and API management and threats to APIs?
Yes, so I think zero trust, the first thing we think of would probably come back to what you just spoke about with the containers and the workloads themselves. So really there, I think what we want to ensure is that, if there is a risk introduced to a workload, wherever that may be, that you contain that, right? So even in the worst case scenario, we saw, a recent vulnerability to web applications, the MoveIt vulnerability. It's actually being leveraged by ransomware crews and its supply chain. So ideally, for us, we protected out of the box from the SQL injection vulnerability that got in the way there. But with zero trust, I think where that comes into play is understanding why each element in your architecture needs to communicate with every other element in that architecture, and limiting reachability to just those required interactions. So rather than having sort of a wide open environment on the back end where you're implicitly trusted, we take a more skeptical view, and based on identity or the knowledge that your web server needs to communicate to a database and maybe an application security protection, but few other things, you can restrict that to limit what an adversary could do, even in that worst case scenario where they popped a shell and gained access to that web server. You limit that secondary impact in the kill chain.
Yeah. I just want to let listeners know. Now, most people know your company, but I'm going to tell how to spell it. It's going to be Akamai, Akamai.com. You can go there. In the show notes, I'm going to have a link to the public sector part of their website. So Akamai.com, very well-known vendor in the community here. They all know it, but I just want to reinforce that. Another well-known person is a guy named Elon Musk. And in the satellite world, he's a big deal in satellite. And I tried to get him on my Sally podcast, and he said, no, many times. But he's also being involved in the API world, too. It's like, hey, I'm crossing these two worlds, like the streams are crossing. So the streams are crossing with Elon Musk and API. So why is he, all of a sudden, he comes out of nowhere, and he's one of these big API guys, huh?
Well, I guess no conversation on any topic in 2023 can take place without mentioning Elon Musk. I think that's another area where we see APIs in the news, right? As many modern web applications such as Twitter, you have these APIs introduced into the platform, so that becomes the battleground. So I think that has certainly been in the news lately of who's allowed to have access to the API. Do they need to pay for that access? What are the terms of service for somebody training AI, LLMs on that API? So I think that maybe the takeaway that's common to all application owners is if you do have an API and you wish to restrict access, you're going to have people that work very hard to get around those controls, right? If you say, we're going to limit this, our API only for consumers, you're going to have very clever folks on the other end that are going to try to work their way around that, even for very well-resourced, huge companies. That's a battle to restrict who can access your API and how they can do that. That's playing out on, probably a smaller scale on just about every publicly exposed API out there. Not long but after you publish an API, where you have, bots and adversaries and other folks coming by to take a look at that.
You used a trending phrase, LLM, large language model. And I have a friend who's got a PhD in math, and she works in this all the time. And she explained to me that, you really got to have, you got to have a big data set here. You can't just pick out, all of Patrick's friends or all the books Patrick's read or something. You have to have this huge, big data set in order to, it's a large language model. So it's a large model. So I would think that any application of artificial intelligence would require, a big, huge data set. And we can go into all kinds of arguments about Gaussian models and this and that. But the point is that if you look at the structure of your company, Akamai has been around there for 20 years. And guess what? Collecting large data sets. When you mentioned the 5 billion hits a sec, this is where you stand. So you're one of the few companies that actually can say, look, been there, done that, got the T-shirt. Yes, we collect. And this is our conclusion after these large data sets. So you're in kind of a unique position here to pound on the table and say, now, wait a minute here. We know what the large data sets are all about, huh?
Yeah, I think, from the perspective of being a provider and to your point, we're sort of a proxy sitting between users, when you go visit a retailer or, many government sites or check your balance and your bank account. In many of those cases, you're actually, hitting an Akamai proxy server very close to where you are. And then we introduce security and performance, before that hit makes its way back to the point where that compute workload actually lives. But we feel we have a responsibility to sort of share some of the trends that we see there, right? Certainly we're seeing, huge volumes of attacks on applications of all sorts, including APIs. Based on our research, adversaries, prefer to target an API 4-to-1 versus traditional web applications. There's a couple of thoughts on that. One is that most attacks start out with a bit of automation. You don't want to just go manually. And if you're driving automation, an API on the other end built for machine-to-machine communication is the preferred interface. So, of course, you would go there to attack. And then the other thought, certainly we didn't interview all the attackers that were pulling these off. The other thought is maybe there's a perception that APIs are not as well protected as traditional web applications. Maybe there is more of that business logic that's been directly exposed. Ironically, we sort of feel that APIs give you the opportunity to have better security than you did with traditional web applications, but you have to do all the right things to really get yourself into that position.
I was at the beach last week, and I was roped in taking a bunch of people to dinner. And I'm sitting with some new people I just met, my daughter's friends. And one of her friends turned to me and said, well, what platform is that on? Ah, interesting. I think if I had Patrick Sullivan sit next to me at Monk's, you might say, the platform you're referring to maybe is the web app API protection platform, huh? So this concept you have here is already kind of maybe distilled into a platform itself, is it?
I think so. Yeah. I think that's another trend we're seeing in security. There's been sort of an explosion of kind of point solutions that are out there in the industry. And I think what you find is sometimes it's harder to consume, dozens of smaller capabilities. So I think the trend that we've seen really play out in the last 18 months anyway is, we end up with these crazy acronyms. It used to be 3-letter acronyms. Now they're 4+ acronyms coming out of Gartner and others. But yeah, the thought there is at the same time that you have a platform that will accelerate your experience for users who are ever more demanding, you can also at the same time mitigate the impacts of DDoS, disambiguate human from bot to make sure that you're serving your humans and not allowing bots to kind of take over, an experience. And then also looking at the syntax of request to make sure that there's not a SQL injection like we've seen with MoveIt and all the chaos that's caused for InfoSec teams over the summer when they should be out at the beach with you, John. They're out chasing down, supply chain attacks that have unfortunately been more successful than people would have liked. And then also, with APIs, what we find is the need to look at sort of behavioral profiling of an API. So if you see, a million requests coming from that API, you kind of understand what's normal, and then you can then identify some things that are abnormal. A lot of these requests, unfortunately, they're all benign. It's just the way that somebody structures them together that they begin to introduce risk. But a lot of times you can't see it just based on one request in isolation. You need to see many requests to start to piece together that somebody's introducing something nefarious and it's not a typical usage of that API.
Last week, my grandson was with me at the beach, and one of his favorite toys is a transformer. And he can tell you everything about transformers. Believe me, Patrick, you're a novice when it comes to transformers. And when I look at your company, it's kind of a transformer. It was a content delivery network for the longest time. And then you kind of notice, well, we're trying to see some of this malicious actors on here, and you're making a transition. It's almost like the transformation now is to a platform for protecting APIs. It started off with CDN, now it's API. So is this a transition you see happening in the next 5 years for Akamai?
Yeah, John, I think you're exactly right. One, I think we started off as sort of a content distribution network. These days, in many ways, we're probably an API distribution network because that's, the majority of what we're carrying. And you're exactly right. Our business has shifted. We were primarily invoked to speed up web applications, but ultimately we do that by being a proxy in front of the web application. So when our customers get attacked, we get the attack first. So now the largest source of our revenue is actually security services, more so than kind of our original business that maybe we were better known for in the early days. That is our primary line of business, is securing web applications and APIs from DDoS, application layer attacks and bots, and then also zero trust segmentation for the workloads themselves. So that's been a transformation that we've adopted across a couple of dimensions there.
I remember reading about Bill Gates years ago, and he talked about first mover advantage. And whether you knew it or not, maybe that's what Akamai had in setting up these proxies all over the world and being closer to their actual users is that they had the catbird seat for observing this traffic, and they were kind of looking at visibility, observing traffic, and they kind of positioned themselves to be leading in some of these concepts, like this whole idea of API scraping. I mean, this is the first time I've heard of this. I mean, and it takes someone to be positioned well enough to see what's going on, to be able to understand this. I mean, this is not a computer 101 concept, is it?
It's not, and I'd like to tell you, John, that somebody at Akamai was prescient enough to kind of think through that. But we built out this architecture of proxies very close to end users, which led us into 4,000 data centers. But it turns out that proxy architecture, safely decrypting TLS, it was SSL in the early days. That's an ideal architecture really to protect applications. I think for us, we really saw that first in the public sector, as some large government agencies were targeted by other nation states, and they sent just, adjusted for inflation, still the largest DDoS that you would have seen. And you needed to be able to decrypt TLS to figure out what was good from bad. And what we found are the agencies that were leveraging our services stayed up, and those that weren't had no hope of just dealing with that massive capacity. So, then we kind of thought about it and said, hey, this makes sense. Let's focus on this. Let's build more software, more consulting services. And then we expanded, from the public sector into financial services and retail and media, many other verticals that face similar challenges.
Yeah, thousands of people. It's very interesting. I hope our federal listeners have a better idea of what Akamai is all about when they think of them, and maybe they can impress their people around the lunch table with API scraping, and who knows, you might be able to impress someone with that one. Well, unfortunately, Patrick, we're running out of time here. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Patrick Sullivan, CTO, Security Strategy at Akamai Technologies.
Thanks for listening to the Federal Tech Podcast. If you like the Federal Tech Podcast, please support us by giving us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.